What's up, y'all? So a few weeks ago, we went over how to plant tomatoes from seeds, and the time has come to pot those suckers up into some larger containers. As you can see, they are looking really, really good. Stick around and I will show you exactly how, why, and when you should pot up your tomatoes to give them a huge leg up in life. Let's do this thing. Why do we bother potting up our tomatoes in the first place? Why not just leave them in their initial container or transplant them directly into the garden? There are three big reasons. First off, we don't want them to become root bound. Reason number 2. If you find yourself with thin, leggy seedlings, maybe they didn't get enough light, maybe they got a little too much heat, well, potting up leggy tomatoes is a really effective way to get them back on the right path. Reason number 3, and most important, we pot up tomatoes because we want to take advantage of the tomato plant's amazing ability to create additional, fully functional roots off non-root organs, namely the stem. Stick with me for a second. I promise we're going to get back to the practical guide, but this is really the basis for why so many gardeners recommend potting up your tomatoes. Tomatoes, and many other plants for that matter, produce what are known as adventitious roots when primordial root structures on the stem make contact with moisture or soil. These adventitious roots can significantly strengthen your plant because they are able to uptake water and nutrients just like normal roots. In other words, each time you transplant your tomato and you bury it deep enough to cover a portion of that stem in soil, you are providing it an opportunity to create a larger, more robust root system than it otherwise would have. Pretty cool, right? Now, until recently, I believed that those fine little hairs on the tomato plant stem were actually the beginnings of those adventitious roots. That seems to be a pretty common myth or misconception out there. Those hairs are actually called trichomes, and they themselves serve a number of important functions, including boosting the plant's resistance to cold and drought, and even providing significant protection from certain types of pests. They're actually also responsible for that characteristic tomato plant smell too. So while trichomes are something completely different, you still may see adventitious roots appear on a portion of the stem above the ground, visible to the naked eye. They'll look like small little bumps or nodules on the stem, or even little root structures beginning to pop out of the stem. Normally that's pretty harmless, but adventitious root growth above ground can signal that the plant is under some kind of stress from some environmental factor like very high humidity or potentially waterlogged roots. Tomatoes and most other nightshades are pretty intolerant of waterlogged roots. They like well-draining soil. I'm going to include a link to a couple really in-depth studies on the types and functions of tomato trichomes and adventitious roots in the description if that's something you're interested in learning more about. If your tomatoes were planted in small containers, for instance, like these 72 cell seedling trays, and you've already culled the extras so that each of those little containers houses only one seedling, I recommend potting up right as those second set of true leaves start appearing. At that point, they're going to be tall enough to benefit from planting the stem deeply, but not yet root bound in the little container. Now, if you've grown a lot of seedlings super densely in one large container, that's totally okay too, but just go ahead and repot a little earlier, say once they have a full set of true leaves, because you really don't want to wait too long and let their roots become super intertwined. That's actually one reason I kind of recommend planting in these seedling trays. It's just a lot easier to transplant the whole soil plug than it is to sort of tease apart dozens and dozens of tiny plants and their fragile little roots. So in terms of equipment, you don't need much. Get enough potting mix ready ahead of time and wet it down really well. Unlike when we planted the seeds, you don't need to sift it or do anything special. For pots, I recommend 3.5 inch like these or 4-inch greenhouse pots, sometimes called nursery pots. They can be a little bit pricey though, so a 16-ounce little plastic cup with some extra holes punched in the bottom is a good alternative. By volume, these two are actually very, very similar. They're almost identical in size. I just prefer these pots because more of them can fit into a tray just because of the shape. And in turn, I need fewer grow lights to take care of the same number of plants. Also, these particular cups are semi-transparent, which is not ideal. Try and find something that's more opaque. Step 1 in the potting up process is to remove the whole soil plug from the container. I like to use an Allen wrench for this because I find it never just punches up through the dirt. If you're having trouble getting out the plug from below, try and gently pull it up by the leaves, not the stem. Go ahead and repeat this step for multiple plants at a time. Just lay them down on a tray as you go. Completing each step for all the plants at one time is so much more efficient than going through the whole process end to end for each plant one at a time. Just make sure that you don't leave the roots sitting exposed for a long time, and make sure you keep them out of the sun until they're repotted. Next, we're going to fill up our containers. I like to fill them about 3/4 full and then dig a nice big hole in the center. That hole should actually be pretty deep because we're going to want the true leaves of the plant just above the lip of the container. Again, we're trying to get that stem nice and deep and buried. Plop that whole soil plug in and gently adjust as needed to get the desired height. Once you're satisfied that those true leaves are just above the lip of the container, go ahead and fill the container up with some of the remaining pre-moistened potting soil and gently pack it in, rinse, and repeat. All right, step 4, final step, just gently water in from above. All we're trying to do here is make sure that we're packing down any air pockets and making sure that the roots are adhering well to the new soil. We don't want to totally over waterlog the soil though. Ideally, from this point on, you're going to go back to bottom watering using like a drainless container underneath your seedling containers. If you're growing your plants under natural sunlight, try and give them a day or two of gentler light just so we can ease them into their new homes. An overcast day, some dappled sunlight, a patch of greenhouse shade cloth will all do the trick. These particular plants are going to go back onto an indoor seedling rack with artificial light, so I'm not too worried about shocking them with too much light. In terms of fertilization, most potting mixes already contain some mild fertilizers, so there's no need to feed them again on transplant day. I will recommend in a few days that you add some worm castings to the top of the container and then just water it in a little bit, or some store-bought diluted tomato fertilizer will work really nicely too. Tomatoes are really hungry, so just don't forget to feed them. And that's it. Happy gardening, y'all.